Yeah, so as Matt so enthusiastically introduced me, my name is Dan Berman. I work at Pixar, and I'm honored to be concluding the animation track of MacDevOps. We've got Disney, Leica, and Pixar all in one block. Very well done. It's really awesome to be following sort of my company cousin Greg, and then Nick. Funny story, I used to work at Leica, and I left Leica to work at Pixar 4 years ago. And my role was filled by none other than Nick Zalotko. So it's a cool sort of full circle thing to be back here and talking with him. Yeah, so this is about everybody's favorite topic in the world. I know as Mac admins, everybody, you love Adobe, right? It's your favorite thing in the world, I'm sure. So this whole, as I'm sure many of you know, there's this whole paradigm shift with how Adobe is deploying licenses and letting the admins manage licenses. And we got a pretty good runway on this change coming. We have a very good relationship with Adobe that goes back a long time, so we knew pretty early on that this was going to be coming down the pipe, and so we had a long time to sort of think about how we were going to handle this. And we sort of used it as an opportunity to sort of, if we knew we were going to have to put in a bunch of legwork to change how we were managing and deploying Adobe applications, we wanted to use it as a time to sort of blow up our entire management of it and sort of start from scratch and sort of try to play ball with Adobe and do things sort of the way that they would prefer us to do it, but also try and maintain as much of the good things of what we were doing before and do like a best of both worlds sort of thing. So first, I'll talk about sort of the old world of Adobe licensing. There's this thing called serialized licensing or serial numbers that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. You build these packages, Adobe packages, in their Creative Cloud Packager tools. I'm sure many of you have probably used this thing before. And the licensing scheme is basically just it's a built-in activation, licenses at install time, and then you true up with Adobe on a yearly basis. And then there was this thing called named user licensing, still exists, but you have your users log in with an Adobe ID. Usually it's your company credentials with a federated ID. And you assign them apps in the Adobe admin console. And then there was this thing called device licensing, which was an educational institution licensing scheme. But it's pretty similar to serialized licensing. It's basically a license per device. But it's only, like it says, it's only for educational institutions, but it works really well. It's just you just put it on a machine, then you don't have to worry about it. So then in the new world, we still have named user licensing, and that's pretty much the exact same as it was before. But now we have this weird thing for education called shared device licensing, where you create the package in the console, but it's only activated with user sign-in. And there's also, I didn't talk about this in the slides, but there's like a timeout that your users have to be aware of where like even if you can't just have one person sign in for too long, it'll eventually time out their login. And when you migrate from device licensing to shared device licensing, they were really creative with the name change there. You only have a 30-day window to complete that migration. So it's like you hit a button with Adobe and they're like, okay, yeah, you're ready to do this. You have 30 days to complete your migration, and that's it. And then there's this really weird one called feature-restricted licensing, which is kind of new and not very well documented. I think Adobe kind of purposefully doesn't make the documentation very easy to find. It's something that's not enabled for you by default. You have to talk to your Adobe representatives. But it is a machine-based license that doesn't care about user. And this is what you would use if you are not an educational institution, because shared device licensing is only for ed. And there are a few different ways feature-restricted licensing works. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it can't use any cloud features. And I don't know if this is still true, but the last time I talked to Adobe, Acrobat is still not supported for this licensing scheme. And it's important to note that shared device licensing and feature-restricted licensing is CC 2019 and up only. So being in an enterprise, I can't speak too much about shared device licensing as it's for education only, but I wanted to give you a couple of resources. People who are very familiar with shared device licensing, Darren Wallace and Neil Martin, part of the London Mac admins group. They are super nice guys, really awesome, great resources. So please, if you are an educational institution and you need to start thinking about migrating, talk to these guys because they have done it and in really cool ways. Also, I just threw this slide in. Yeah. I bet a lot of you got a really sinister and terrifying email from Adobe about a month ago. It looked like this. I'm not going to read this whole thing. This is Adobe's words. But basically, some legal stuff went down, and you need to make sure that the unauthorized versions of the Adobe apps in that right side of that table are not in your environment. Otherwise, you could be open to copyright infringement liability. So yeah, this just happened and it sort of shook up. I don't know if anybody was in the Adobe Mac Admin Slack channel when the day after this happened. It was crazy. Oh, also, that reminds me, Patrick Fergus is also an amazing resource in the Adobe Mac Admin Slack channel. I have been terrible about involvement in that Slack channel, but Patrick Fergus is amazing, and he's a really great resource as well. So feature-restricted licensing is this super weird thing. We needed to use it because we have a lot of machines that are in this, it's this use case where we can't have our users kind of constantly signing in and out of the Creative Cloud desktop app, even though we've migrated and named user licensing. So we had to figure out some way that, like, for example, like a machine that's in a screening room or in a review room or an art room or a story room where it's like a lot of people are coming and going and it's one central machine with shared login. It wasn't going to work for people to sign in and out all the time. So the first mode, which is what we use for most of these situations, is called connected. And basically the way it works is that you install either an FRL package on the workstation, or you install just a little binary in a JSON file, I think, and then run the binary against the JSON file, and it does, like, it talks up to Adobe and activates itself. This requires an active internet connection, which is fine most of the time for us, but very occasionally we have air-gapped computers that need to be able to do this, and that's where the second method comes in. It's called an isolated activation method for feature-restricted licensing, and basically the way it works is that they give you a little binary that you run on the workstation. It hands you off a key. You plug that into your Adobe admin console. It spits you back out another key, and then you run that on the air-gapped workstation, and it knows that that matches up, and it activates. So there's one more. And Adobe has not made this official, but they have given me permission to talk about this. And it's called LAN activation. And as far as I know, there's only like 2 customers of Adobe that are actually using this. And I think they are both departments of the United States government that I probably shouldn't say any more about. But the way it works is that they let you run an on-prem license server, essentially. And you do that key handoff. With Adobe's servers, you take the key, you get a device ID from your license server, you run it to Adobe, they give you a key back, you activate your license server, and now all of your internal computers that are completely, that only talk on the LAN, they now talk to your on-premise license server and do their activations that way. But if you are interested in this, you should talk to your Adobe rep because this is, as far as I know, not documented at all on Adobe's end of things. So enough about FRL. So when we were going to be, I'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of the sort of the serial and named thing. As far as control over app deployment, serial is, you know, it's a lot better. They have a lot more. I mean, you're packaging stuff up and you're deploying it yourself, so you have pretty much all the control you could ever want or need. as far as upgrades go, again, serial is a lot easier. When you're doing the CCDA thing with named licensing, your users have control over when they upgrade to different versions. For shared workstations, obviously serial is way better. It's a device license. It doesn't care who's on the machine or how many users. It just licenses the computer. Not so with named. But the user experience is better in named. Mostly that's because the users have the control now. They can get the new versions of things with all the new fancy features at their convenience. And they don't need to rely on putting in a help desk ticket for getting an app installed. The support burden is a lot easier in the named license world because you're not doing any packaging. It takes away a lot of that overhead on your admin team. And for home use, it's way easier in the named license world. In the serial world, if you had to be, I don't know how many of you were actually doing the whole home use program thing, but technically with Adobe, you're allowed to run 2 licenses. And in the serial world, you could give your user a license with your normal serial number. You make another Creative Cloud package for them. You'd probably have to make a separate one because so it wouldn't use your internal update server. And then you'd have to give that to them, and they install it at home, and something wouldn't work, and you'd troubleshoot it with them. In the named license world, it's all the CCDA, and they give you 2 activations of every app. So you can have 2 simultaneous logins, one for home and one for work. But none of that even really matters because as of this year, serial numbers are kind of no longer a thing. So yeah, every customer that's using serial numbers, you're going to have to migrate either to named licensing or shared device licensing. Presumably, if you are on device licensing, you'll go to SDL. And if you are on serial, you'll go to named license. If you want to use CC 2019, you're going to have to move to named or shared device. And if you have a serial that's coming up on expiration, you're not going to be able to renew that with Adobe. They're going to make you migrate. So there were sort of 5 big questions for us when we were going to be doing this migration, things that we didn't really know how we were going to handle. The first one is, how are we going to do user management? How are we going to get all of our users up into Adobe's servers so that we can assign them apps and stuff? And how are we going to do all of that app entitlement? The second question was, how are we going to convert all of our existing users from serial and named licensing? So we have a ton of Adobe installations out in our environment. How are we going to just seamlessly for all of our users just transition those in place from serial and named? How do users get access to new apps? So what does it mean, like if I have Photoshop and I need to get Illustrator, what does that look like? Or if I don't have any Adobe apps and I need Photoshop, what is that process for requesting and then being granted and installing that whole, what is that going to look like? How are we going to do app updates? We were using Remote Update Manager before to varying success. Now that we have this other tool, CCDA, how does that fit into this? And just sort of in general, how can we be smarter about distributing these entitlements? You know, we had a history of just sort of giving people licenses willy-nilly. You know, you get Photoshop, no matter what your use case was. If you asked for it, you were probably going to get it. So just in general, how can we be smarter about that? And the answer, as any sysadmin will tell you, is the answer to all of life's problems inevitably is automation, yes. So let's talk about the first question. How do we handle user management in general? So some of you are probably familiar with this thing that Adobe gives you. It's called the Adobe User Sync tool. And basically what it does is it acts as an intermediary between your directory and Adobe's servers. So basically, we run it on a Linux VM. AAT, I'll talk about what that is a little bit in the presentation, but you can see we have all of these groups in LDAP, one for each Adobe product, and then the user sync tool maps those groups to equivalently named groups in Adobe Creative Cloud. And so it just syncs the membership of those groups to the memberships in the Adobe groups. Okay, how do we convert our existing serial installs to named license? So it's just figuring out what does that flow look like? And this is what that flow looks like. So basically, it starts with us evaluating who needs it. And so you can see sort of in the blue is what's happening on the client machine, and in green what's happening sort of on the back end on the server side. So once we know who the users are, we add them to the group, the LDAP group, for their specific Adobe product. We run the Adobe remove volume serial script that Adobe gives us to strip away all of the serial information on the machine. So when someone's added to LDAP, that triggers UST, which goes up to Adobe and adds them to the groups, and that activates their entitlements. Meanwhile, on the machine, it's installing the Creative Cloud desktop app. And then when all this is done and it's verified that they have their entitlement, it emails the user. It says, hey, you've just been migrated to named license, and you can go ahead and sign into the Creative Cloud desktop app, which is already on your computer. So the next question is, how do we handle app updates? And a lot of you are probably familiar, if you manage Adobe applications, with this thing called Remote Update Manager. It's basically a command line utility that installs Adobe.releases. When it works, it is great. It's very simple. It just installs updates in the background like you would expect it to, but it comes with a couple of caveats. You can only install .releases with this tool. You can't install like a full revision, go from CC 2018 to CC 2019. And RUM will fail if certain conditions are met. That's basically a nice way of saying that RUM is a little bit fragile. It will fail if there is a pending reboot. It will fail if you have any of a number of Adobe processes running. It will fail if the user wore a yellow shirt that day. It will fail if Mercury is in retrograde. There are a lot of ways that it will fail. So when Remote Update Manager fails, which it does fairly often, how do we have like a backup, a contingency plan to handle those? And we have this thing that we do called update nagging. So Adobe gives us this tool, the Creative Cloud desktop app, which we're already installing everywhere. So, and that is actually way better at running updates than Remote Update Manager is. So we try to take advantage of that. So if RUM fails 5 times, we pop up a little notification to our user that says, hey, we're trying to, or there are some Adobe updates available for your Mac. Could you please go to the Creative Cloud desktop app and install these? And I'm sure if your users are anything like mine, anything that you pop up in front of them, they're just going to say, no, later, dismiss, remind me later, whatever. So if they click later on this nag 5 times, they're going to get a pop-up that says, okay, it looks like you need some help. You've dismissed this now 3 times, and either you need some help or something's broken. So we've gone ahead and submitted a work request, or what we call a help this ticket, on your behalf, so that then a Mac admin can go and follow up with them. So when it comes to our user base and Adobe apps, we have a lot of Adobe users, as you can imagine, and they can be pretty voracious about getting new versions of the Adobe apps. This is sort of the prevailing attitude when it comes to our users with Adobe apps. So knowing this and how much people want it, and in our history of just sort of not being good about auditing usage and how many people were asking for the app and how many people were being given it regardless of use case, how can we be a little bit smarter about distributing these out? And we came up with a couple of solutions. The first one is called gatekeeping. We call it gatekeeping. And basically, users have to request a new Adobe app. If they don't have one and they need their first one, or they just need a new one, it's the same process. So they will put in a request. Anybody on our admin team can review to make sure that this is legit, or they can intervene and say, hey, there are alternatives. If you need to crop a photo, maybe Photoshop isn't the best tool for the job. You have a million other things that can do that. So admin reviews it, and then they can approve or reject it from there. And we also do automated expirations. So we are constantly capturing application usage data from Jamf, but if you don't use Jamf, there's a bunch of other ways that you can do this as well. And if somebody hasn't used a particular Adobe app for 30 days, we automatically remove their entire entitlement. And the important part is that we do that silently in the background, because what's the first thing a user is going to do if you tell them, oh, it looks like you weren't using Photoshop, so we're going to take that entitlement away? What's the first thing they're going to do? That's right. Well, they're not going to be able to open Photoshop, but they're going to put in a help desk ticket that says, hey, you took away my Photoshop. Give it back. And then they won't use it for another 6 months. And also, yeah, there's no need to do any uninstalling or anything like that, because the control of the license and our sort of liability with the license is all, up on Adobe's end. They don't care about the client. It's all the licensing is controlled on Adobe servers. So we don't have to install uninstall the app or anything like that. So how do users get access to Adobe apps? What was that whole process from a user needing the app until it's installed and they're using it? What does that whole process look like? And I have a little demo video for you. It might go a little fast. I'm going to try and walk you through it. But it basically looks a little something like this. So if I'm an Adobe user and I need, let's say I have Photoshop, but I need Illustrator, so you can see it just says try there. I'm going to go ahead and open up self-service, and I'm going to find Adobe Illustrator, and I'm going to hit this. Ask me, hey, why do you need Illustrator? What's the reason? I'm going to say, okay, I need to edit some graphics. Okay, fair enough. It just tells us that a work request has been generated. Now I'm switching over to the admin side. You can tell it's an admin because it's in dark mode. And so I see this work request came in. It says I need to edit some graphics. Okay, that looks legit. So I'm going to copy that work request number. I'm going to run this tool called Adobe Approval Tool, or AAT, and put that work request number. And it's going to say, hey, this is the reason. Does this look legit? Yes, this looks legit. I approve this request. And now it's added the user to the group, which triggers the Adobe User Sync tool. It sends the user an email saying that their request has been approved, and then they can now use the Creative Cloud Desktop app to install Illustrator. And look at that. Illustrator is now available for them to install. Their entitlement is active. Really? You guys are usually impressed. Yeah, sorry, I cut that part out. Sorry, well, I'll go ahead and download one, and we'll wait patiently while it finishes. So here's sort of what's happening in that whole process. And then again, in green is sort of the action that is happening, and in blue is sort of what's happening in the background. So it starts with that user making the request in self-service, filling out that little, that's basically Jamf helper and Cocoa dialog to get that feedback that then talks to our work request API, creates a work request. That gets assigned to an admin, and it notifies them either over email or Slack. When they approve that with the AAT, which is just a Ruby CLI tool, and that adds them to the LDAP group using our Ruby LDAP module. And then the Adobe User Sync tool sees that change, it syncs it up to Adobe's servers, and it automatically activates their entitlement because they're in that group. And then it notifies the user via email or Slack. So I should probably mention really quick that there's this thing called named license packages. If you are still totally committed to doing your own packaging and deploying packages out yourself, regardless of the licensing mechanism, you still can do that. They'll give you named license packages, which are just shell packages that don't have any license information. You can do that, but it also disables the apps panel by default. Maybe that's what you want, maybe that's not what you want. It's just something to think about. But this also has some caveats. Obviously, the first one is that you're still having to do all your own packaging. But maybe you want to be spending a lot of time packaging Adobe apps. I know that in the old way, I dreaded every fall when they would release the new versions, we'd have to package up every single one again. But and yeah, this way users have to wait for IT to get new releases. We wanted to give our users sort of the empowerment to, like, if a new version comes out, that they can get that. we want our users to get accustomed to using the Creative Cloud desktop app because that's, we're sort of towing the line with Adobe on that one. Adobe would prefer that you use their tool, and it's, as a company that's trying to go self-service in every way possible, they've already given us this self-service tool for managing all their apps in the best way, so we might as well use that. Right, now last one is basically what I just said. If we're going to change how we do everything, we might as well try to do it the way Adobe wants us to. So also a quick note about all apps. Early times I did this talk, the first question I always got from people was like, what about all apps? And the thing about all apps is that we decided to skip all apps because doing this whole automated expiration model means that we almost never need all apps, which is a more expensive license. So we can do this sort of piecemeal single app licensing model because when we're automatically expiring things that aren't being used, then nobody's ever really crossing that threshold where all apps becomes worth it. I think you need to use, maybe it depends on your agreement with Adobe, but there's a certain number of apps that you need to be using simultaneously for all apps to become worth it from a cost perspective. And we found that there was almost nobody at our entire studio that made sense for, especially if we're doing the automated expiration. So yeah, we didn't need to do that with all the automation that we had set up. So just the sort of final takeaways. I hope that you use the user sync tool. It is great. And we use self-service to your advantage for this. And it's worth mentioning, we do this sort of audit trail and approval process because we want to be better about deploying these licenses in a smart way. If you don't care as much about who has what licenses and what they're using these Adobe apps for, you could totally skip all that. You could just have your self-service trigger, just add them to the group and immediately give them entitlement. You could do that. It might be expensive for your company, but you could do that. Remote Update Manager, use it. Even though it has its faults, use it because it will take care of updates for a lot of your user base. But have a backup plan, like to point people to the Creative Cloud Desktop app, which is better about running updates. Gatekeeping and expiration is great for keeping your costs down and sort of making sure that only the people who need the apps are the people that have access to the apps and that you're paying for those licenses. And sort of the general outlook on this whole project was sort of, I'm okay to give up a little bit of control over deployment and updates and management if it means that I can save a lot of time both on my end and all of the frontline teams. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. I think we have 1 or 2 minutes for questions, if anybody has any. Yeah, back there.
Adobe licensing is suffering. We have time for one question, maybe 1.5. But.
Yeah, someone back there had a question.
Oh, sorry.
Right here.
Well.
I couldn't see you.
I'm hiding behind your screen. I had a question because you said you had these shared machines, and do people, if they log into this machine, do they have one account? Do they have to log in? Do they have to log into the Adobe?
Right. So with the shared machines and feature-restricted licensing, it's a device license. There's no signing in that has to happen. It's just this machine has its own license.
Okay. So you don't use this system for the shared machines.
Well, that's what feature-restricted licensing. That's what we use feature-restricted licensing for.
And the other, it was such a short question, maybe I can ask another one. This is, of course, a broader topic, but if every vendor requires you to do this, you're going to build a whole farm just to get the licensing ready. Did you talk with Adobe about that?
So we had a lot of conversations with Adobe about how this was all going to work. And Adobe is a very expensive product suite for Pixar, just because we use a lot of it. We have a lot of it at Pixar. As you can imagine, we're an animation studio, and we have a lot of people that need Adobe apps. And so it was going to be the cost to put in this legwork to build all this automation and automated management of all of our licenses was going to be worth it for us in the long run on the cost that we were going to save for all the licenses. When I showed Adobe this sort of completely automated cost-saving measures that means we are only ever paying for what we need at a minimum level, They were like, I think the reaction they had was like, huh. They were, I mean, we're totally within our EULA to be able to do all this automated management, but it sort of means that, you know, they love it when people deploy licenses willy-nilly and just give everyone who asks for Photoshop. But, you know, they liked it, you know. At least our tech reps liked it. I'm not sure our salespeople liked it, but they were.
Thank you, Dan.
begrudging.
I think we got to cut it off. We're going to have a reception at 5 o'clock. So we'll continue our Adobe love and.
Yeah, if you have any questions, someone back there had a question. We didn't get a chance, but come see me after, and if you have any questions, yeah. Do I get a Matt hug?